Most of you have heard this first story. It's kind of my signature story. I tell it a lot. But that's okay, because this is a story about the value of hearing stories over and over again. When I was a little kid, I know that's kind of hard to imagine, but once upon a time, I was a little kid. And I used to sit out on my parents' screen porch and listen to the katydids and the crickets. The katydids going, "Who did it? Who did it? Katy did. Who did it?" And I would listen to the katydids and the crickets, and I would listen to the adults tell stories. Now, there were different groups of relatives who'd come through at one time or another, and whenever the one group of relatives would come through, they'd tell one set of stories, and whenever another group of relatives came through, they'd tell a different set of stories, and all these relatives would tell the same stories year after year. And there was nothing on earth sweeter, nothing sweeter than sitting there listening to the same stories in those mellow, quiet, adult voices who chuckled a little at the appropriate places. It was so fun. And there was never a time in my life when I felt more at home, more peaceful, more in the right place. And then, Linda, you're doing this, and I back up. Okay, the way you do that's this. Okay, is that better?
She does that all day long.
She does that all day long. So, something you should know is I'm in the midst of a permanent hot flash. And so I'll do this from time to time. Then puberty happened. And my hormones kicked in. And you need to understand that I had some raging hormones. And my sister's nodding at me. And I became angry and rebellious and miserable to deal with. I took up smoking when I was 12. I took up drinking because that's what you do when you're smoking. I did a little shoplifting. I did a little vandalism. And my parents had no idea what to do with me. One day, Dr. McCarran, the headmaster of the private school where I was enrolled, called us in. And he said, "Mr. and Mrs. Pearsall, perhaps your son would be happier in a different school." I had been expelled. So my parents sent me to my Uncle Lanny's farm for a summer of behavior modification. Now, there were several people on Uncle Lanny's farm, but there are only two you really need to know about, and one of them was Uncle Lanny. And Uncle Lanny was a quiet man. He was tan from here down and white as snow from here up. He almost never spoke, but if he did speak, he spoke about rain. That man cared more about rain than anybody else on planet Earth. He was very opinionated about whether it would or not, and he was also very opinionated about whether it should or not. And Uncle Lanny had one fantastic talent. He could chew tobacco and spit with more genius than I have ever seen under any other circumstances. He grew his own tobacco. He'd grow a leaf about this long, and he'd twist it up till it looked like a rope, and then he'd hook it over his thumb, wrap it around twice, and then twist the ends together so it came out looking a little bit like an auger or a screw eye. Then he would hang that in the smokehouse with his hams and his sides of bacon until it was ready. And then he'd carry it around in the front pocket of his bib overalls, and all during the day he'd reach out and pull out his clasp knife. He collected clasp knives, so it was kind of a different one each time. But he'd pull his clasp knife out and saw off a piece of that chewing tobacco and put it in his mouth, which gave him a kind of a southern Tennessee accent when he talked. But everybody could understand him because he's used to doing it. And every now and then, he'd haul off and go, and this long, slick stream of something looked just like used motor oil would be ejected from his mouth. And if you were a grasshopper on a Joe Pye weed 7 feet away, you were toast. Uncle Lanny never missed. Now, the other person on the farm that you need to know about was a hired hand, a guy named Jim. And Jim took an instant dislike to me. Jim hated me. Probably because he thought that I was a smartass, stuck-up, know-it-all city slicker, which, of course, is exactly what I was. And so Jim gave me my nickname for the summer. Jim named me Dipstick. And after a day or two, Uncle Lanny took it up. And then Aunt Betty and Aunt Gladys and some of the other folks, my cousins and all the folks on the farm. And then it kind of spread up and down the street. And before the end of the summer, I was Dipstick to the whole county. And Uncle Lanny and Jim considered it their moral duty to give me the worst, hardest, most miserable, hot, nasty jobs that could be found. If there was 4 people getting in the winter wheat, well, Uncle Lanny drove the combine and Jim sewed the sacks shut and my cousin Lanson drove the flatbed, and I ran out in the field and grabbed a 100-pound sack of wheat, drug it over and drug it over and drug it over and threw it up. And then ran out, grabbed another one and drug it over and drug it over and drug it over and threw it up. When we got through doing wheat, I did the same damn thing with straw. So they set out to make me miserable. I think my dad had suggested that they do that. But anyway, I hated them. I hated those 2 rednecks. I considered them the stupidest, meanest rednecks I'd ever met in my life. I was almost certain that neither one of them could even name a beat poet. Well, I resolved to go through that summer unbroken. I was not going to be subdued by these mean rednecks. I was not going to be taken down. I was going to prevail. I was going to handle this. And there was this one thing that was going to get me through it, and that was dinner. Now, dinner on the farm is served at noon, and it features at least 2 kinds of meat, at least one of which is chicken, fried chicken. It features a half a dozen vegetables, all cooked with pork fat. I never saw a salad on the farm. There was always cornbread and biscuits, and there was always 2 kinds of pie. Chess pie, which is a slight mispronunciation of just pie, and some kind of fruit pie, and all the sweet tea you could drink. And after you'd engorge yourself at the dinner table, then we'd all go out on the front porch and sit there for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then Uncle Lanny'd say, well, I reckon it's time to get back to work. And out we go. Well, I thought dinner on the farm was heaven. And I thought, all I really have to do is make it from one dinner to the next. I can take an infinite amount of abuse, I can take an infinite amount of torture. I can take an infinite amount of pain if I can just get from one dinner to the next. Well, the first job we did that summer was getting in the winter wheat. And after, I don't know, several weeks of getting in winter wheat, it looked to me like we were fresh out of winter wheat. And Uncle Lanny said, no, tomorrow we're going over to the next county where I've rented some fields. I've got some winter wheat over there. So the next morning, we spent the whole morning with the combine and the John Deere and the Ford flatbed. Took us a half a day to get to the other wheat fields. As soon as we got there, I thought, dinner. But there was no way to get back to the farm for dinner. And Uncle Lanny said, well, that's all right. We'll just go down to the Alto General Store. So we went to the Alto General Store, and let me first describe the Alto General Store to you. It's a little gray shack, and it's sitting out in the middle of this large parking lot. And there's a little bench out front, and in front of the bench there's this one gas pump. And across the street is the co-op with the grain silos. And the parking lot is paved with bottle caps and motor oil and tobacco spit. And it is an amazingly durable substance. And on a really hot summer day, it could be kind of fragrant. Well, we went into the general store, and my Uncle Lanny says to the proprietor, he says, Floyd, give these boys a slab sandwich, an ROC Coca-Cola, and the moon pie. Now, everybody in here can figure out that a ROC Coca-Cola is an RC Cola, right? And everybody in here knows what a moon pie is. If you don't, you can leave. But now I think a slab sandwich requires a little clarification. To make a slab sandwich, you take 2 pieces of Wonder Bread, perfectly square, and then you get this ham that is sort of a compressed ham meat thing that's in a long square tube, and it's lubricated with stuff that looks like KY jelly. And you slide this block of ham out and you saw off a slab, and you lay it on the Wonder Bread. And then you slide it back in. It goes in and out with no trouble at all. And then he grabs the cardboard box with the yellow lid, and he pulls out this block of pasteurized processed cheese food. And he unwraps the aluminum foil around that and saws off a slab of that, and he puts that on. And you understand that all 6 of these pieces bread, or all 4 of these pieces bread and ham and cheese and bread, they're perfectly congruent. There's no wasted space in there at all. And he glues all that together on both sides with lots of Miracle Whip. And that is a slab sandwich. So it did not measure up to dinner. And I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make it after all. And we went out to the front, went out to that little bench out in front of the Alto General Store, and we all sat down on the bench and started eating our slab sandwiches. Except for Jim. And Jim's wife must have loved him a lot, because she would pack up a full-size grocery bag and send him dinner on the go. And he sat down next to me, and he opens up this bag, and it has got 20 treasures in it, and every treasure is wrapped in aluminum foil. And he reaches in there and he pulls one thing out and he unwraps it and he says, "Golly, dipstick, what do you reckon that is?" And I said, "Well, Jim, that looks like a piece of meatloaf." And he says, "Meatloaf? That's a lot better than a slab sandwich, ain't it? And I said, well, Jim, it is. And he says, you want a bite of my meatloaf dipstick? And I said, sure. And he said, no, and he ate it all up. And then he reached into his sack and he pulled out this other aluminum foil treasure and he unwrapped it, and it was celery sticks with pimento cheese. And he said, golly there, dipstick, what you reckon them are? And I said, well, Jim, those are celery sticks with pimento cheese. And he said, and they're a lot better than a slab sandwich, ain't they? And I'd say, well, yeah, they are. And he'd say, well, you want a bite? And I'd say, sure. And he'd say, no, and he'd eat them all up. He went through the whole damn sack, all 20 treasures, repeating this performance. The next day, I said, I'm not going to put up with this. So I went around to the back of the Alto General Store and sat down on a stack of tires to eat my slab sandwich, and Jim followed me. And he came out and sat down on another stack of tires, scooted his tires up next to mine. Golly, dipstick, what you reckon that is? Looks like a piece of fried chicken, Jim. You want to bite of my fried chicken there, dipstick? No, Jim. Oh, you lying to me, dipstick. You know you want a bite of my... So I'd say, okay, give me a bite of that chicken. And he'd say, no, and he'd eat it all up. So then next day I tried a different strategy, and he'd pull something out of his bag and say, golly, dipstick, what do you reckon that is? And I'd say, I don't know. You lying to me, dipstick. You are lying, lying, lying. You know that's a chocolate brownie. Any idiot knows that's a chocolate brownie. And you know you want a bite too. Okay, Jim, give me a bite. Nope, and eat it all up. So then I tried another strategy. He unwrapped it and he says, golly, dipstick, what do you reckon them are? I said, Jim, those are deviled eggs. Get them out of my sight. I hate them. I hate them. They make me want to throw up. They look like dead people's eyes after they've been dead for a while. Get them away from me. You lying again, you lying rotten dipstick. You lying to me again. I've seen you eat them deviled eggs. I've seen you eat them deviled eggs at dinner. I know you like them now. You want one right now, don't you? No. Yes, you do. And this would go until finally I'd say, okay, Jim, give me a damn deviled egg. Nope, and eat them up. Well, I got wore out with it. I just got completely wore out with it. And that night, I went out behind the house to the pig pen, and I got me a little ball of pig mud. And I fashioned it up into a nice little ball. And I spit on it and polished it so it shone a little bit. And then I went up to the house and I wrapped it in aluminum foil. And the next day, I'm back out there on the back. No, actually, I was out front, sitting on the bench. I was sitting out front on the bench. And Jim's sitting here, and Uncle Lanny's sitting here, and Jim reaches into his bag and pulls out something. He says, golly, dipstick, what do you reckon that is? And I said, Jim, that's pork chop. Can I have a bite? You see, I was kind of in a hurry. I was all excited about the climax. But he could tell something was up, so he backed away a little bit and said, nah, and ate it up. And he went through the rest of the sack, and I learned to be patient. I learned to pretend I didn't want any, and then he would force me, and then I would eat it. And finally, I thought it would never come. I was like waiting for Christmas. Finally, he reached down in the bag and pulled out the treasure. And he unwrapped it, and he looked at it, and he said, golly, dipstick, what's that? He didn't know. And being a Southern gentleman, I told him. I said, Jim, that looks like a Mudball. You better give it to me. And he said, a Mudball? You lying to me again, dipstick. You never stop lying to me. You lying all the damn time. My wife would never give me a Mudball, and he popped it in his mouth and ate it. Now, at that exact moment, Jim heaved over on his knees, gagging and spitting and coughing and having a terrible time. And over here, Uncle Lanny, he heaved over on his knees, gagging and spitting and coughing, too. Now, Jim was gagging and spitting and heaving and coughing because he'd swallowed a Mudball. Uncle Lanny was gagging and spitting and heaving and coughing because he had laughed so hard he swallowed his quid. Well, vengeance was mine. Vengeance was sweet. And I reveled in it for every bit of 20 minutes. And then it was back to the field and back to torturing me. And Jim never tortured me with his lunch bag again, but they found lots of other ways. And I thought I was going to die of the miseries before the summer was over. We finally got all the winter wheat in, and then we got in all the winter straw, the wheat straw. And it looked to me like the next thing coming up was hay. And then Uncle Lanny said, no. And then he said several things about rain. And he said, we're not going to do the hay right now. We're just going to take tomorrow off. We'll go fishing. Fishing? I was a city slicker. I had never been fishing in my life, and I had no interest in going. It sounded like pure hell. And so I said, no, thank you very much. I'll stay here at the house and read. Well, the next day, I was, sitting on the banks of a TVA lake with my bobber out there in the middle of the lake. I'd been very careful not to actually put a worm on the hook. And so I've got my rod, and I'm watching that bobber out there and swatting flies and mosquitoes and sweating. It was hell. It was just a horrible, hot, nasty, miserable afternoon. And then Uncle Lanny started talking. And he wasn't talking about the rain. He was telling some of those old screen porch stories from when I was a little kid. He told the story of Uncle Leonard chasing his straw boater right down the middle of the busiest street in Miami. And he told the story about Aunt Vera's very first girdle, and as it turned out, her very last. And he told the story about Uncle John coming across the Cumberland Mountains in an ox cart with his family on board. One of his daughters being Aunt Gladys back at the farmhouse. And as Uncle Lanny told those old stories, the world changed. All of a sudden, that miserable, hot, sweaty, buggy summer afternoon was golden. And there I was sitting on the edge of a TVA lake looking at a bobber which floated at the exact center of a perfect universe. I just was born again with a bobber. I had no idea a feeling could be that sweet. Well, all of the anger and hatred, not all the rebellion, but all the anger and hatred, just drained out of me like water. And at various times in my life, anger and hate have tried to come back. They've tried to work their way into my life one way or another, and I don't let them. I know them. I've known them for a long time. They're not welcome. They can't stay. And that afternoon, I learned the power of storytelling. And that's why I am a storyteller.